There were things done in the American South that were never meant to be spoken about, not because they were unusual, but because they revealed too much. This is the story of a child left vulnerable, a father who believed ownership could solve any problem, and a woman purchased to serve quietly, who made a decision that would echo far beyond a single night. What happened was not rebellion, not escape, not violence. It was something far more unsettling. The master believed he was acting out of necessity, not cruelty. That was how he justified the decision to himself, how he explained it to others when questions arose. His household had been unraveling since the death of his wife, and nothing unsettled him more than disorder within his own walls. The house had once moved according to rules. He understood meals at fixed hours, servants attentive but silent, a child who followed instructions and slept through the night. After his wife's passing, those rhythms faltered. His daughter grew restless, her sleep fractured by sudden waking, her days marked by silences that no discipline could correct. Physicians spoke in vague terms, offering remedies that failed as often as they were tried. Neighbors murmured sympathy, but sympathy did not restore control. What the master wanted was not understanding, it was resolution. He wanted the problem removed, contained, solved in a way that did not require him to change. In his world, solutions could be purchased. He did not see the act of buying another human being as extraordinary. It was familiar, normalized, woven into the logic of his life. When something broke, it was replaced. When labor was required, it was acquired. Care, to him, was another form of labor, quiet, constant, uncomplaining. He told himself that a woman accustomed to obedience would provide the patience his household lacked, that proximity to suffering would not trouble someone already accustomed to hardship. He did not consider what that proximity might awaken. He did not consider that grief recognizes itself, even across lines of power and ownership. The woman arrived on a gray morning, escorted without ceremony. There was no announcement of her name, no acknowledgement of what she had lost to arrive there. She was introduced as function rather than person, instructed immediately on her duties. Care for the child. Remain within the nursery and adjacent rooms. Do not speak unless addressed. Obey without delay. The master delivered these instructions with the calm assurance of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He assumed compliance, because compliance had always been assumed of people like her. The woman listened carefully. She always did. She had learned long ago that survival depended less on resistance than on attention. Attention to tone, attention to timing, attention to what was said and what was deliberately left unsaid. She did not react visibly to her surroundings, though she noticed everything: the arrangement of the rooms, the way servants avoided eye contact, the tension that lingered in the house like a held breath. She noticed the child most of all. The girl sat rigidly when her father was present, her small hands clenched in her lap, her eyes darting toward the door as if measuring distance. When he left the room, the child's posture softened slightly, but her fear did not disappear. It simply shifted inward. The master mistook the womanness, silence for emptiness. He mistook her stillness for passivity. These mistakes comforted him. They allowed him to believe the solution he had purchased would function without complication. He left the nursery confident that order would be restored through routine and firmness. He did not stay to observe how the woman knelt beside the child as bed later that evening, not to instruct, not to correct, but simply to be present. The child did not speak at first. She watched the woman with suspicion sharpened by loss. Adults had become unpredictable since her mother, as death alternating between indulgence and anger, between absence and control. The woman did not demand conversation. She did not fill the silence with reassurance. She understood that silence, when not forced, could become safe. She sat where the child could see her, her presence steady, her movements slow. When the child shifted restlessly, the woman adjusted without comment, aligning herself with the girl, unease rather than opposing it. Night came quietly. The house settled into sleep. Somewhere beyond the nursery walls, the master retired, believing the problem had been delegated successfully. The woman remained awake. She had been told to watch the child, and she took the instruction seriously, not in the way the master intended, but in the way experience had taught her. Watching meant observing more than behavior. It meant listening to breath, to the pauses between movements, to the subtle changes that signaled fear long before words could name it. The child stirred frequently. Each time, the woman responded with the same calm attentiveness. She did not scold. She did not threaten. She did not invoke the authority of the father who frightened the girl into silence. She allowed the child as restlessness to unfold without judgment. This was not indulgence. It was recognition. Recognition that grief does not follow schedules, that fear cannot be disciplined away. By morning, nothing dramatic had changed. The child had not transformed. She had not been cured, but she had slept longer than she had in weeks. The master noticed this only in passing, registering it as confirmation that his decision had been correct. He nodded once, satisfied, and returned to his concerns. The woman was praised indirectly, as one might praise a tool that functioned as expected. No conversation followed, none was required. Days passed in this manner, each one reinforcing the master as belief that he had resolved the problem. The woman remained quiet, diligent, invisible in precisely the way he preferred. The child's outward behavior improved just enough to reassure him. Fewer outbursts, fewer interruptions to his routine. He did not ask why. Asking would have required attention. Attention, in his mind, was no longer necessary. What he did not see was how the nights unfolded. When the house slept, the child's fear returned with greater clarity. Without the distractions of daylight, memories pressed closer. She whispered questions into the darkness, questions she had tried to ask her father and had been silenced for attempting. Questions about her mother, absence, about the suddenness of it, about things she had seen and been told not to remember. The woman did not answer immediately. She understood that questions often needed space before they could be held safely. She listened first, allowing the child's words to exist without interruption. This listening was not accidental. It was deliberate. The woman knew that being heard without correction could be transformative, especially for someone whose world had narrowed suddenly. She had lived in that narrowing herself, had felt how authority compressed possibility, how silence was enforced rather than chosen. She did not seek to guide the child toward any particular conclusion. She sought only to create a space where the child's thoughts were not immediately punished. The child noticed this difference quickly. She began to speak more, not because she was encouraged, but because she was not stopped. She spoke of fear that had no name, of dreams that woke her shaking, of moments when her father's anger had filled the room without warning. The woman absorbed these words without visible reaction. She did not flinch. She did not express shock. Shock, she knew, would have taught the child to retreat again. The master remained unaware of this exchange. His world continued to revolve around visible order. As long as the child performed obedience in his presence, he believed progress was being made. He did not consider that obedience could coexist with inner turmoil. He did not consider that care, offered without control, might reach places discipline could not. The woman moved through the house with increasing familiarity, her access expanding subtly as trust grew. No one questioned her presence in the nursery at night. Care was assumed to be harmless. The intimacy of caregiving, especially when performed by someone deemed powerless, did not register as threat. This assumption protected her. It allowed her to remain where she was most needed without scrutiny. As weeks passed, the child's demeanor changed in ways too subtle for the master to identify. She did not become louder or more defiant. She became more observant. She began to notice inconsistencies in her father's behavior. The way his words shifted depending on audience, the way his authority relied on silence rather than explanation. These observations did not immediately lead to confrontation. They settled quietly within her, reshaping how she understood the world around her. The woman did not instruct the child to think this way. She did not criticize the master openly. She understood that overt challenge would only provoke retaliation. Instead, she modeled a different way of existing, one that acknowledged fear without surrendering to it, one that allowed questions to remain open rather than forcing premature answers. This modeling was perhaps the most dangerous thing she did, though she did it without drama or declaration. The master sensed that something was improving, though he could not articulate what. The child slept. The household grew quieter. Servants moved with less tension. He attributed this to restored discipline and congratulated himself on his foresight. He did not notice that the improvement came not from increased control, but from its absence in one small corner of the house. Night after night, the woman remained with the child, listening as fears surfaced and receded. She learned the cadence of the girl's thoughts, the moments when memory pressed too hard, the signs that a question was forming but not yet ready to be spoken. She responded with patience shaped by her own history, by an understanding that some truths could not be forced into the open without harm. The woman's presence became a constant, and constants have power. They provide reference points, anchors in a world that has become unpredictable. For the child, the woman's steady attention offered something she had lost with her mother's death: not authority but safety. Safety not defined by rules but by reliability. The master did not perceive the shift as significant. He measured success in visible compliance, not internal change. As long as his daughter performed obedience, he believed his authority intact. He did not consider that authority unexamined could be quietly undermined by understanding. By the time he noticed anything amiss, it was not because of defiance, but because of clarity. The child began to ask questions during the day, careful questions, framed politely but persistent. Questions about her mother, illness, about the decisions that had been made without her knowledge, about things she remembered differently than she had been told. The master dismissed these inquiries at first, attributing them to childish imagination. But imagination, he knew, could be corrected through firmness. He spoke sharply, he redirected, he reminded her of her place. The child did not argue. She returned to the woman that night with the same questions, now heavier, now tinged with disappointment. The woman listened, as she always had. She did not contradict the master directly. She did not undermine him with accusations. Instead, she acknowledged the child as confusion, validating the experience of not understanding rather than offering answers that might provoke danger. This approach unsettled the master more than open defiance would have. He sensed a change he could not control, a shift that did not announce itself loudly enough to punish. The child remained obedient, yet something in her gaze had altered. It held awareness now, a quiet assessment that made him uncomfortable. He responded by tightening boundaries. The woman was instructed more strictly. Her movements were monitored, her access limited in small, incremental ways. He told himself this was precaution, not fear. Fear, he believed, belonged to those without power. The woman accepted these changes without protest. She had anticipated them. She understood that moments of transformation rarely went unnoticed forever. She adjusted her behavior, preserving what mattered while appearing compliant. The child noticed this adjustment and learned from it, absorbing another lesson without it being spoken. The night that would later be described as shocking had not yet arrived, but its foundation was already laid. It was being constructed quietly, through listening, through recognition, through the refusal to silence questions that demanded space to exist. The master believed he had purchased obedience and care. What he had introduced into his household instead was awareness, and awareness, once present, does not disappear simply because authority demands it. The tightening of boundaries did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in increments so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone less attentive than the one. A door that had once been left ajar was now closed. A lamp that had been kept burning through the night was extinguished earlier. Instructions were repeated with greater specificity, as though clarity itself could neutralize whatever unease had begun to surface. The master told himself these changes were reasonable, even necessary. He framed them as adjustments, not corrections. Adjustments preserved the illusion that nothing fundamental had shifted. The woman received each instruction with the same measured composure she had always displayed. She nodded, she complied. She altered her routines just enough to satisfy oversight while preserving what mattered most. This balancing act required constant attention. She could not simply repeat what she had done before. She had to adapt, to anticipate scrutiny without inviting it, to maintain presence without provoking suspicion. Experience had taught her that authority often mistook quiet compliance for emptiness. She relied on that mistake now more than ever. The child felt the changes immediately. Children are sensitive to alterations in rhythm, especially when those alterations touch the fragile scaffolding of safety they depend upon. The girl noticed that the woman no longer sat as close during the day, that conversations were shorter, more fragmented. She noticed the way her father's gaze lingered longer, measuring rather than observing. These changes unsettled her, not because they were dramatic, but because they threatened the one space where her thoughts had been allowed to exist without consequence. At night, when the house settled into its uneasy quiet, the woman adjusted her approach. She spoke less, listened more. She learned to communicate through presence rather than words, offering reassurance not through explanation but through consistency. The child learned to read this language quickly. A shift in posture meant the woman was alert. A slight change in breathing signaled caution. Silence became not absence, but signal. This shared awareness did not develop through instruction. It emerged through necessity. The master's efforts to restore order intensified as his discomfort grew. He could not articulate the source of that discomfort, which made it more troubling. Nothing outwardly defiant had occurred. His daughter remained polite, attentive, obedient. The woman continued to perform her duties without complaint. And yet, something in the household felt altered. The stillness he once associated with control now carried a different quality, one he could not quite identify. He responded the way he always had when uncertainty threatened his authority, by asserting it more visibly. He reminded the child of expectations, of gratitude, of the sacrifices made for her well-being. He spoke of responsibility, of obedience as virtue. He did not ask how she felt. Feelings, in his view, complicated matters unnecessarily. What mattered was behavior. The child listened carefully, her face composed. She nodded at the appropriate moments. She did not challenge him, but she no longer absorbed his words unquestioningly. The night spent really listening to the woman had taught her something subtle and powerful. She had learned that silence could hold meaning, that not every truth needed to be spoken immediately, that some understanding grew stronger when carried quietly. The woman recognized this shift with a mix of relief and concern. Relief, because the child was no longer alone with her thoughts. Concern, because awareness made her more vulnerable to scrutiny. The woman knew too well how systems responded to those who began to see beyond the roles assigned to them. She did not regret what she had done. Regret implied alternative choices, and she had never truly had those. But she understood that the space she had created could not remain hidden indefinitely. She adjusted again, refining her presence further. She became more cautious during the day, limiting interactions to what was strictly required. She avoided eye contact when others were present, presenting herself as the compliant caregiver the master expected. At night, she resumed her quiet vigilance, ensuring that whatever comfort she offered left no visible trace by morning. The child learned to mirror this caution. She stopped asking questions during the day. She returned to the woman at night with thoughts she had learned to store carefully. This storing did not burden her in the way silence once had. It felt intentional now, purposeful. The woman helped her understand, without saying it directly, that timing mattered. That safety was not just about what was said, but when and where. As weeks passed, the master's unease sharpened into suspicion. He could not point to a specific transgression, but his instincts told him something was amiss. He began to observe the woman more closely, noting her movements, her expressions. He did not see defiance. He saw something worse, control not originating from him. The woman's calm unsettled him. Calm suggested self-possession, and self-possession challenged the hierarchy he relied upon. He responded by limiting her autonomy further. He instructed other servants to check on the nursery at irregular intervals. He restricted the woman's movement after dusk, citing concern for propriety and order. He told himself these measures were preventive, not punitive. Prevention, after all, sounded reasonable. The woman accepted these restrictions outwardly, but inwardly she recalculated. Each new boundary required adjustment, a reconfiguration of how she could maintain the fragile space she and the child shared. She understood that the master's vigilance would not diminish on its own. Authority, once unsettled, rarely relaxed without external reassurance, and reassurance was not something she could safely provide. The child sensed the increased scrutiny and adapted instinctively. She learned to perform compliance with greater precision, offering her father exactly what he expected to see. Politeness sharpened into performance. Obedience became deliberate. This performance did not erase her awareness, it concealed it. The woman watched this development with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride, because the child was learning how to protect herself. Sadness, because such learning came at a cost no child should bear. The household moved through its days under this new tension, each person adjusting in small ways that collectively altered its atmosphere. Servants spoke less freely. Movements became more measured. The master's presence loomed larger, his authority reinforced through repetition rather than confidence. What he did not understand was that repetition, without belief, did not restore control. It revealed its fragility. One evening the master confronted the woman directly. His tone was calm, but his words carried accusation. He reminded her of her place, of the boundaries she was expected to respect. He warned her against influence, against forgetting the nature of her role. He did not specify what she had done wrong. He did not need to. The warning itself was meant to be corrective. The woman listened without interruption. She did not deny the charge. Denial invited argument. Argument invited escalation. Instead, she acknowledged his authority with the same measured deference she had always shown. She assured him she understood her responsibilities. Her voice remained steady, her expression neutral. Nothing in her response gave him grounds for punishment. This frustrated him. He wanted reassurance that his authority was unquestioned. He wanted evidence that whatever unease he felt was unfounded. The woman, compliance, offered no such reassurance. It was too precise, too controlled. He dismissed her with a gesture, telling himself he had reasserted order. That night, the child could not sleep. The confrontation, though she had not witnessed it directly, had been felt. Children are attuned to shifts in emotional weather. The girl sensed the danger pressing closer, the narrowing of space. She whispered questions into the darkness, her voice barely audible. Questions about what would happen next, about whether the woman would be sent away, about what she should do. The woman listened, weighing each response carefully. She could not promise safety. Promises would have been lies. She could not instruct the child to resist openly. Resistance would have invited consequences the child could not bear. Instead, she offered something else, guidance shaped by experience rather than rule. She spoke of patience, of watching, of remembering. She told the child that understanding did not always need to be acted upon immediately, that sometimes the most important thing was to carry it intact, protected from those who would misuse it. She did not frame this as lesson. She framed it as reassurance, as something the child already possessed. The child absorbed these words quietly. They did not eliminate her fear, but they gave it shape. Fear, when shaped, could be managed. The girl learned that night that her thoughts belonged to her, even if her behavior did not. This distinction mattered. It preserved something essential. The master, unaware of this exchange, continued his efforts to restore the sense of order he believed had been disrupted. He scheduled the woman's removal from the nursery earlier each evening. He reassigned some of her duties, ensuring she spent more time under observation. He told himself these changes were temporary, that once things returned to normal, restrictions could be eased. Normal, however, no longer existed in the way he remembered it. The woman felt the tightening of time acutely. She knew that her access to the child was shrinking, that whatever work she had done might soon be interrupted permanently. This knowledge did not prompt haste. Haste would have undone everything. Instead, she focused on consolidation, ensuring that what the child had learned would endure even in her absence. She adjusted her interactions accordingly, emphasizing not specific information, but ways of thinking. She encouraged the child to trust her own observations, to notice patterns, to recognize when words did not align with actions. She did this without direct criticism, without naming the master or the system explicitly. Naming would have been dangerous. Instead, she spoke in generalities, in stories that carried meaning without accusation. The child responded with surprising maturity. She asked fewer questions, but those she asked were more precise. She learned to hold uncertainty without panic, to sit with discomfort without immediate resolution. These skills did not make her happy. They made her resilient. The master noticed the child's composure and misinterpreted it as success. He believed his increased control had produced the desired outcome. He relaxed slightly, reassured by appearances. This relaxation did not extend to the woman. He had decided, without consciously admitting it, that she was the variable he could not control. Variables threatened systems built on certainty. The decision to remove her began to take shape quietly, justified to himself as practical rather than punitive. The household, he reasoned, no longer required such intensive care. The child was improving. Another arrangement could be made. He did not consider the cost of this removal beyond his own convenience. The woman sensed the approaching end of her role without being told. Experience had taught her to read these signs, the shift in tone, the narrowing of access, the way conversations happened around her rather than with her. She did not protest. Protest would have accelerated the outcome without preserving what mattered. Instead, she focused on the nights that remained, using them to reinforce what the child had already begun to understand. These final nights were quiet, almost tender, not because danger had receded, but because both of them understood the fragility of the time they had left. The woman did not fill the silence unnecessarily. She allowed the child's thoughts to surface at their own pace, offering acknowledgement rather than instruction. She trusted that the child, understanding, once formed, would not dissolve easily. The master slept through these nights unaware of what was being secured beyond his reach. He believed authority could undo influence retroactively, that removing the woman would erase whatever she had done. He did not understand that understanding, once internalized, did not require presence to endure. By the time the decision to remove the woman was finalized, the household had already been altered in ways he could not reverse. The child had learned to see. The woman had fulfilled her role not as the master defined it, but as necessity demanded. What remained was the moment yet to come, the night when words would be spoken that could not be taken back, the night that would later be described as shocking not because of violence, but because of its consequence. That night had not yet arrived, but it was now inevitable. The inevitability of the night ahead did not announce itself with drama or warning. It arrived through an accumulation of small certainties that neither the master nor the household could fully articulate, but which the woman felt with unmistakable clarity. The decision to remove her had settled into the house like a draft, cool and persistent, touching every room without ever being named aloud. She sensed it in the way instructions were delivered shorter now, stripped of pretense. She sensed it in the careful avoidance of her presence by those who once relied on her. And she sensed it most clearly in the child. Best questions which had grown fewer not because curiosity had faded, but because the child was learning how to hold understanding without exposing it. This learning, the woman knew, was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because it preserved the child's inner life. Dangerous because inner lives, when they grow coherent, threaten systems that depend on confusion and dependence to survive. The master's resolve hardened quietly. He did not frame the removal as punishment. Punishment would have acknowledged wrongdoing, and he could not identify any that could be named without implicating himself. Instead, he told himself it was an adjustment, a rebalancing of roles now that the crisis had passed. He spoke of efficiency, of propriety, of returning the household to its proper arrangement. He convinced himself that the woman's influence had been benign at best, unnecessary at worst. In truth, he felt something closer to apprehension than certainty. He had begun to recognize that the woman's calm was not the calm of submission. It was the calm of someone who understood more than she revealed. That understanding unsettled him because it existed beyond his reach. The child, meanwhile, moved through her days with a new attentiveness. She observed the way her father's patience thinned when questioned, the way his authority required reinforcement through repetition. She noticed how servants adjusted their behavior around him, how silence fell into place when he entered a room. These observations did not frighten her in the way they once had. They clarified the contours of power. Clarity did not remove fear, but it changed its texture. Fear became something she could anticipate rather than something that ambushed her. At night, when the woman sat nearby, no longer as close as before, but close enough the child did not speak immediately. She learned to let silence do its work first, to allow thoughts to settle before offering them into the open. The woman recognized this shift and adjusted her presence accordingly. She understood that the most important work had already been done. The child no longer needed answers as much as she needed confidence in her own perception. The woman focused on reinforcing that confidence subtly, through acknowledgement rather than instruction. When the child expressed uncertainty, the woman did not rush to resolve it. She validated the uncertainty itself, teaching the child that not knowing immediately did not mean being wrong. This lesson, delivered without fanfare, altered how the child related to authority more profoundly than any direct challenge could have. As the days passed, the master's preparations became more concrete. Arrangements were discussed in low voices. A date was mentioned, then confirmed. The woman's removal would occur soon, quietly, without ceremony. He believed that minimizing disruption would prevent questions. He did not consider that questions had already taken root where he could not reach them. He also did not consider that removal, once enacted, could not reverse what had been shared. Influence, once internalized, did not depend on proximity to persist. The household sensed the approaching change and responded with heightened caution. Servants avoided lingering. Conversations shortened. Everyone understood that transitions carried risk. The woman remained composed, her demeanor unchanged, even as the space she occupied contracted further. She did not seek to bargain for more time. Bargaining would have drawn attention. Attention would have accelerated the outcome without securing anything additional. Instead, she conserved her energy for the moment she knew was coming, the night, when the child would ask the question that had been forming for weeks, the question that could not be answered indirectly. That night arrived without announcement. The house settled early, as it often did now, its routines shaped by the master's desire for order. The woman was instructed to leave the nursery earlier than usual, a final assertion of control framed as concern for propriety. She complied outwardly, withdrawing to the threshold where she could still hear the child's breathing. She waited, not anxiously but attentively. Waiting, she had learned, was not passive when done with intention. The child lay awake, her thoughts arranged carefully as though preparing for a journey she could not postpone. She knew that the woman would not be there much longer. She knew that whatever she needed to understand had to be understood now, while the space still existed. Fear pressed against her chest that it did not overwhelm her. The woman's steady presence, even at a distance, anchored her. After some time, she spoke softly, testing whether the words could exist without consequence. When no reprimand followed, she continued, her voice gaining steadiness as the question finally emerged. She asked about her mother, not about illness or death in the abstract, but about the moments that had been avoided, the arguments that had ended conversations abruptly, the silences that followed raised voices, the nights when her mother's fear had filled the room without explanation. She asked whether what she remembered was real or something she had been told to forget. The question carried weight not because of its content alone, but because of its implication. It challenged the version of events the master had constructed and enforced through omission. The woman did not answer immediately. She understood the danger of speaking too quickly, of offering a response shaped by urgency rather than care. She moved closer, positioning herself where the child could see her clearly. She listened again, allowing the question to settle into the space between them. This pause was not hesitation. It was respect. Respect for the child as courage in asking and for the gravity of what answering would entail. When the woman did speak, she chose her words with care. She did not accuse the master. Accusation would have transformed the moment into confrontation, something the child was not equipped to carry. She did not dismiss the child as memories either. Dismissal would have repeated the harm already done. Instead, she acknowledged the child's experience as valid, naming the confusion and fear without assigning blame. She spoke of adults making choices that children are not meant to understand, of truths being hidden because they are inconvenient, of memory persisting even when it is discouraged. This response did not provide closure in the conventional sense. It did not resolve the child's grief neatly. What it did instead was affirm that the child's perceptions were not wrong. That affirmation landed with quiet force. It reorganized the child's understanding of herself. She was not broken. She was not imagining things. She had been noticing. The woman continued carefully, explaining that some people believe control was the same as care, that enforcing silence was a way to manage discomfort rather than address it. She did not frame this as a lesson about the master specifically. She framed it as an observation about the world. The child listened, absorbing the implication without needing it to be spelled out. Children, the woman knew, often understood more than adults gave them credit for. What they lacked was permission to trust that understanding. That permission was what the woman offered now. The conversation did not last long. Length would have increased risk. The woman ended it gently, reassuring the child that she was not alone in her questions, even if she would soon have to hold them without companionship. She reminded the child of her own strength, not as something to be proven through defiance, but as something that could exist quietly, intact, regardless of circumstance. She did not promise safety. She promised awareness. By morning, the child was changed. Not visibly, not in a way that would invite immediate suspicion. She moved through the day with the same politeness she had always shown. She followed instructions. She performed obedience with care. But something in her gaze had shifted decisively. It held coherence now. She looked at her father not with fear alone, but with understanding. Understanding does not announce itself loudly, but it alters dynamics irrevocably. The master noticed the change and felt a surge of unease he could not explain. The child's compliance no longer reassured him. It felt measured, deliberate, as though she were choosing it rather than submitting to it. This distinction unsettled him deeply. Authority in his world relied on submission that erased choice. Choice, even when exercised quietly, threatened the foundation of his control. He responded with irritation masked as concern. He questioned the child more closely, probing for signs of defiance. He found none. He reminded her of expectations of gratitude, of the sacrifices made on her behalf. She nodded at the appropriate moments, offering him nothing to punish. This restraint frustrated him. Punishment required transgression. Without transgression, his authority had nothing to act upon. The woman, as removal was enacted shortly thereafter, exactly as planned. There was no farewell, no explanation offered to the child. The master believed this abruptness would sever whatever influence the woman had exerted. He told himself that distance would undo intimacy, that silence would erase memory. He did not understand that memory, once validated, did not depend on proximity to endure. As the woman was led away, the household exhaled with a mixture of relief and tension. Order, the master believed, had been restored, the variable removed, the problem solved. He did not look back. He did not see the child watching from the doorway, her expression composed, her understanding intact. The days that followed unfolded with outward normalcy. The nursery was reorganized, new routines introduced. The child was supervised more closely, her movements monitored under the guise of care. She complied, offering no resistance, but compliance now functioned differently. It was no longer rooted in confusion or fear alone. It was strategic. It preserved space. At night, when the house slept, the child revisited the woman as words, not as a script to follow but as a framework for interpretation. She began to notice how truth was shaped by power, how silence was enforced to protect authority rather than people. These realizations did not lead her to rebellion, they led her to patience. Patience, she now understood, could be active rather than passive. The master, unaware of the depth of this change, continued his life convinced he had corrected a deviation. He believed the night in question had passed without incident, that whatever had unsettled him had been neutralized through decisive action. He did not know that what had occurred that night was not something that could be undone through removal. It was not a breach of rules. It was a transfer of understanding. Understanding moves quietly. It does not announce itself with disruption. It waits. It observes. It endures. The woman disappeared into another ledger, another arrangement, her presence erased from the household. Official memory, but her work remained. It lived on in the child's gaze, in the way she listened, in the way she learned to hold questions without surrendering them. The master believed the story ended with the woman's removal. In truth, it had only just begun. What she had done that night did not shock because it was loud or violent or defiant. It shocked because it changed the direction of her life without leaving visible marks. It introduced clarity where confusion had been enforced, and that clarity would carry consequences long after the household returned to its routines. The night passed, the house slept, and somewhere within its walls, a child lay awake, understanding for the first time that truth, once spoken gently and held carefully, could not be taken back no matter how tightly authority closed its doors. The days following the woman's removal unfolded with an outward smoothness that reassured the master and unsettled the household in equal measure. Order, at least as he defined it, appeared to have returned. The nursery was quiet again. The child followed instructions with the same precision she had always shown, perhaps more so now. Servants moved through their tasks without comment. The master interpreted this calm as confirmation that his decision had been correct. He told himself the influence had been excised, that whatever discomfort he had sensed was merely a temporary disturbance caused by excessive familiarity. He believed distance restored hierarchy, that separation could undo intimacy. What he failed to recognize was that intimacy, once internalized our understanding, no longer required proximity to endure. The child adapted quickly to the new routines imposed upon her. She woke when told, dressed when told, ate when told. Her compliance was flawless, so flawless that it began to feel uncanny. She no longer hesitated before responding. She no longer startled when addressed sharply. She appeared, to the casual observer, calmer than she had been in months. The master noticed this and felt a measure of satisfaction. Calm, to him, meant control. It did not occur to him that calm could also mean containment, that the absence of visible distress did not signal the absence of inner life. At night, when the house settled into its familiar hush, the child lay awake longer than she once had. Sleep came eventually, but it no longer arrived as escape. It arrived as decision. She learned to revisit her thoughts deliberately, to examine them without fear, to hold them apart from the rules that governed her behavior during the day. This separation between inner and outer worlds was new to her, and it gave her a sense of agency she had never experienced. Agency did not manifest as defiance. It manifested as coherence. She knew what she believed, even if she did not say it aloud. The master sensed a change but could not locate it. He observed his daughter closely, searching for signs of disorder he could address. He found none. Her obedience gave him nothing to correct. This absence of error unsettled him more than open resistance would have. Resistance provided clarity. It justified force. It reaffirmed hierarchy. Obedience without belief, however, offered no such reassurance. It left him uncertain, and uncertainty eroded his confidence in ways he could not admit. He responded by intensifying supervision. The child was accompanied more often, her movements tracked under the guise of care. Lessons were structured more rigidly, her schedule filled to prevent idle thought. The master believed that occupation would crowd out whatever influence remained. He did not understand that influence, when rooted in understanding rather than instruction, could not be crowded out by routine. Routine might distract, but it could not undo awareness. Servants noticed the shift as well. They saw how the child's behavior had changed not in ways that drew punishment, but in ways that altered the rhythm of interaction. She listened more than she spoke. She asked fewer questions, but when she did, they were precise. She no longer accepted vague answers. This precision unsettled those accustomed to being obeyed without explanation. They responded with impatience or avoidance, neither of which satisfied her. She learned quickly which questions could be asked safely and which were better carried privately. The master mistook this discretion for improvement. He believed the child had learned her place more thoroughly, that her earlier restlessness had been corrected through firmness. He congratulated himself on his foresight, telling himself that indulgence had been the true problem all along. He did not reflect on the source of the change. Reflection would have required acknowledging the woman as role, and acknowledging that role would have undermined the logic of her removal. As weeks passed, the household settled into a new equilibrium, one maintained through vigilance rather than ease. The master's authority remained unchallenged outwardly, but it required constant reinforcement. Instructions were repeated, expectations clarified, boundaries restated. The repetition itself signaled strain. Authority that once functioned through assumption now required articulation. Articulation invited scrutiny, even if unintentionally. The master found himself explaining rules he had never had to explain before, justifying decisions that had once been unquestioned. The child listened to these explanations with a composure that made him uncomfortable. She did not argue. She did not interrupt. She absorbed his words carefully, weighing them against her own observation. She noticed inconsistencies, the way rules shifted depending on circumstance, the way authority invoked principle when convenient and discretion when threatened. These inconsistencies did not provoke immediate reaction. They accumulated, forming a pattern she could not yet name but already recognized. The woman's absence was felt most acutely at night. Without her presence, the child learned to self-soothe in new ways, relying on routines the woman had modeled, rather than words she could no longer hear. She remembered the cadence of the woman's breathing, the way silence had been allowed to exist without pressure. She recreated that space for herself, lying still, letting thoughts rise and fall without judgment. This practice gave her a sense of continuity, a reminder that the woman's influence had not been severed, only relocated. The master noticed that his daughter no longer sought comfort from him. He told himself this was appropriate, even desirable. Independence, he believed, would strengthen her. Yet beneath this rationalization lay a subtle loss he could not name. The child, as emotional distance deprived him of a form of validation, he had come to rely on the assurance that his authority was necessary, that without him she would falter. Her steadiness now suggested otherwise, and that suggestion unsettled him deeply. He responded by reasserting control in ways that appeared reasonable but carried an undercurrent of fear. He limited the child's exposure to outside influences. He restricted correspondence. He monitored her reading, ensuring it aligned with approved narratives. He framed these measures as protection, not recognizing that protection without trust becomes confinement. The child accepted these restrictions outwardly, offering no resistance. Inwardly, she learned to read between lines, to recognize the difference between protection and control. The household, as servants, navigated this environment with practiced caution. They understood that transitions invited scrutiny, that any misstep could be interpreted as defiance. They spoke less freely, avoided unnecessary interaction, performed their duties with heightened attention. The atmosphere grew more controlled, but also more brittle. Small errors provoked disproportionate responses. The master's patience shortened, his tolerance diminished. He attributed this to the demands of responsibility, unaware that it stemmed from a deeper anxiety he refused to confront. As months passed, The child's growth became more evident. She matured in ways the master did not anticipate. Her composure deepened. Her questions, when they emerged, were carefully framed to elicit information without inviting censure. She learned how to listen for what was not said, how to interpret pauses and evasions. These skills, cultivated quietly, allowed her to navigate the household with increasing autonomy, even as her visible freedom remained constrained. The master noticed her intelligence and took pride in it, so long as it reflected well on him. He spoke of her progress to visitors, framing her calm as evidence of effective discipline. Visitors nodded politely, accepting his narrative without challenge. None lingered long enough to notice the undercurrents shaping the household, the tension beneath its polished surface. The master took their approval as validation, reinforcing his belief that order had been restored. Yet order, once disrupted, rarely returns unchanged. The child began to experience moments of quiet defiance, not in action but in interpretation. When rules were enforced arbitrarily, she noted the arbitrariness without reacting. When explanations contradicted earlier claims, she stored the contradiction rather than confronting it. This internal cataloging gave her a sense of continuity that external rules could not provide. She understood now that authority relied on selective memory, that forgetting was often encouraged as a form of obedience. She refused to forget, even when silence was required. The woman, as lessons continued to surface in unexpected ways, the child found herself comforting other servants, children when fear overwhelmed them, offering presence rather than instruction. She did not repeat the woman as words, she embodied her approach. This embodiment went unnoticed by the master, who rarely observed interactions that did not involve him directly. He remained focused on maintaining the appearance of order, not on examining the quiet transformations occurring within it. The master, as discomfort grew more pronounced as time passed, he could not shake the sense that something essential had slipped beyond his grasp. He searched for it in routines, in discipline, in reassurance from others. He found none. The household functioned, but it no longer reassured him. He found himself increasingly irritable, quick to assert authority over minor matters. This escalation did not restore his confidence. It revealed its absence. The child sensed this escalation and adjusted accordingly. She became more cautious in his presence, offering him exactly what he sought: obedience, politeness, deference. She did not challenge him openly. She did not provoke confrontation. She understood now that confrontation would only harden his resolve. Instead, she conserved her energy, preserving her understanding for moments when it could be used without immediate risk. The woman, now gone from the household, existed only in memory. But memory, when nurtured deliberately, remained potent. The child revisited their conversations not as instructions to be followed, but as frameworks for interpretation. She understood that the woman had not told her what to think. She had taught her how to think, how to recognize patterns, how to sit with uncertainty, how to trust her own perceptions, even when they conflicted with imposed narratives. This understanding deepened as the child grew older. She began to see how the master's authority relied on silence and repetition, how it discouraged examination rather than encouraging understanding. She recognized that his discomfort with questions stemmed not from concern for her well-being, but from fear of losing control over the story he told himself. This recognition did not provoke anger, it provoked clarity. Clarity, she learned, could be carried quietly until circumstances allowed it to surface safely. The master, unaware of the depth of this change, continued to believe he had resolved the problem by removing the woman. He did not see that what he had removed was not influence but witness. The woman had witnessed the child. Sphere, without dismissing it, had acknowledged her perceptions without correcting them. That acknowledgement had altered the child's relationship to herself. It had given her a foundation no amount of control could erode. As the household settled into its new routines, the night that had once been described as shocking receded into memory for those who believed the story ended with the woman as removal. For the child, however, that night remained present, not as a singular event, but as the beginning of a different way of understanding the world. She carried it with her through each day, through each interaction, through each enforced silence. The master's authority persisted, but it no longer defined her inner life. She had learned to separate obedience from belief, compliance from truth. This separation did not make her reckless. It made her resilient. Resilience, she discovered, did not require confrontation. It required coherence, the ability to hold one understanding intact even when external circumstances demanded performance. The household continued, outwardly unchanged. Meals were served, lessons conducted, duties performed. To the casual observer, nothing remarkable occurred, but beneath this surface a transformation had taken root, one that would shape the child's future in ways the master could not predict or control. The woman's absence did not erase her impact. It clarified it. Her quiet listening had given the child something no authority could revoke, the confidence that her perceptions mattered. That confidence did not announce itself loudly. It waited, patient and intact, for a time when it could be expressed without immediate consequence. And in that waiting lay the true shock of what the woman had done that night, not because it defied authority openly, but because it changed the direction of a life in ways authority could not reverse. The passage of time did not soften the master's certainty, but it did sharpen the contrast between what he believed he controlled and what had already moved beyond him. Months passed, then seasons, and the household settled into a rhythm that looked stable from the outside and felt increasingly strained within. The child grew taller, her voice steadier, her movements more deliberate. The changes were subtle enough to escape immediate notice, yet profound enough to alter the balance of the household. She no longer moved as someone waiting to be corrected. She moved as someone who understood the rules well enough to navigate around them without breaking them. This distinction mattered, though the master did not yet grasp why. He took pride in her outward composure, speaking of it to others as evidence that discipline and structure had prevailed. He told stories of her improvement with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had proven a point. Visitors nodded, offering polite affirmations, and the master absorbed their approval as validation. Each nod reinforced his belief that authority, once reasserted, could correct any deviation. He did not notice that his daughter listened to these conversations with quiet attentiveness, registering how easily narratives were constructed and accepted when they served power. The child, as education intensified as she grew older, lessons became more demanding, expectations higher. She was praised for her intelligence so long as it aligned with obedience, encouraged to excel within boundaries that were carefully defined. The master believed knowledge could be controlled through selection, that exposure to approved material would shape thought predictably. He did not consider that understanding does not arise solely from what is taught, but from how it is interpreted. Interpretation, once learned, could not be confined by curriculum. She approached her studies with the same careful attention she had learned in the nights after the woman. Removal, she listened not only to what was presented but to what was omitted. She noticed which topics were emphasized and which were avoided, which questions were answered directly and which were deflected. This awareness did not make her cynical. It made her observant. Observation became her quiet discipline, her way of engaging with the world without drawing attention to herself. The master, sensing her growing intelligence, alternated between pride and unease. Pride, because her composure reflected well on him. Unease, because intelligence, once acknowledged, could not be fully directed. He responded by tightening expectations further, framing rigor as preparation for adulthood. He spoke of responsibility, of the importance of knowing one's place. He did not realize that the child now understood place as something imposed rather than inherent. This understanding did not provoke rebellion. It fostered patience. Patience altered how she experienced time. Days no longer felt like obstacles to endure, but opportunities to observe. She watched how authority shifted depending on context, how rules bent for some and hardened for others. She noticed how fear shaped behavior more effectively than instruction, how silence was enforced selectively. These observations accumulated, forming a quiet archive she carried with her. She did not share this archive with anyone. Sharing would have exposed it to distortion or punishment. Instead, she preserved it intact, trusting that its value would emerge when circumstances allowed. The master's authority continued to function outwardly, but it required increasing effort to maintain. He found himself explaining decisions he once would have issued without comment, justifying actions that had once been assumed necessary. This need for justification unsettled him, though he would not have admitted it. Authority that required explanation felt less solid than authority that simply existed. He responded by invoking tradition, by appealing to what had always been done, as though repetition could substitute for conviction. The child listened to these appeals with growing discernment. She recognized tradition as narrative rather than inevitability, as a story told to legitimize existing arrangements. This recognition did not lead her to reject tradition outright. It led her to examine it. Examination, she had learned, was the first step toward understanding, not necessarily toward change. Change, she suspected, would require conditions not yet present. As she matured, moments arose when the master's control was tested not through defiance, but through circumstance. A question from a visitor that touched too closely on topics usually avoided. A disagreement between servants that exposed contradictions in enforcement. In these moments, the child observed how quickly authority shifted from confidence to defensiveness. She noticed how explanations became sharper, more insistent, as though volume could compensate for fragility. These moments confirmed what she had already begun to understand, that power depended on perception as much as force. The memory of the woman remained present, not as a figure to be idealized, but as a reference point. The child recalled not specific words, but the experience of being listened to without judgment. That experience had reshaped her expectations of interaction. She no longer accepted dismissal as natural. She recognized it as choice. This recognition did not make dismissal easier to bear, but it prevented her from internalizing it as truth. The master, unaware of this internal evolution, continued to believe the household functioned according to his design. He attributed the absence of overt conflict to successful management. He did not consider that conflict, when suppressed rather than resolved, often transformed into something quieter and more enduring. He believed he had neutralized influence by removing its source. He did not understand that influence, once internalized, no longer depended on proximity. As the child approached adolescence, her presence in the household shifted. She was given more responsibility, more visibility. The master framed this as trust earned through obedience. She accepted these responsibilities without comment, recognizing that increased visibility came with increased scrutiny. She learned to balance this scrutiny with discretion, to reveal competence without revealing conviction. This balance required constant adjustment, but it came naturally to her now. She had been practicing it for years. In moments when she was alone, she revisited the night that had changed everything, not with longing, but with clarity. She understood now that what had occurred was not a single conversation, but the beginning of a different relationship to truth. Truth, she had learned, did not always demand expression. Sometimes it demanded preservation. Preservation required patience, discernment, and the willingness to wait for conditions that allowed truth to surface without being destroyed. The master began to sense that his daughter was outgrowing the narratives he had constructed for her. He noticed her questions becoming more nuanced, her observations more precise. He responded by emphasizing loyalty, by reminding her of the benefits of compliance. He spoke of gratitude as obligation, of obedience as virtue. She listened respectfully, offering no challenge. Her silence reassured him temporarily, even as it concealed a growing independence of thought. Servants noticed the child as evolution and responded with a mixture of admiration and caution. Some saw in her composure a reflection of their own unspoken understanding. Others avoided her, wary of proximity to someone whose intelligence might attract unwanted attention. The child navigated these responses carefully, offering kindness without intimacy, presence without familiarity. She understood now that relationships, like truths, required context to be sustained safely. The household continued under the master's rule, outwardly unchanged. Yet beneath this surface, the seeds planted by that night continued to grow. The child's awareness deepened into discernment. Discernment shaped her choices, her silences, her timing. She did not yet know what form her future would take. She did not yet know when or how her understanding would be tested. What she did know was that she was no longer dependent on the master's narratives to make sense of her world. The master, for all his vigilance, could not reclaim what had been lost. He could enforce behavior. He could restrict access. He could shape routine. But he could not erase understanding once it had been acknowledged. That acknowledgement, offered quietly by a woman whose presence he had dismissed as inconsequential, had altered the trajectory of his daughter's life in ways he could neither predict nor prevent. The shock of what the woman had done that night did not arrive as immediate consequence. It arrived slowly, unfolding through years of quiet transformation. It manifested not as rebellion, but as resilience, not as confrontation, but as clarity. The master believed he had restored order. In truth, he had only delayed recognition of a change already set in motion. And as the child continued to grow, carrying her understanding forward with careful patience, the household moved unknowingly toward a future shaped not by the master's authority, but by the quiet, enduring influence of a truth that had once been spoken and could never be taken back. As the years continued to layer themselves one upon another, The quiet transformation that had begun in the child did not stall or reverse, it deepened, settling into her like a second consciousness that shaped how she interpreted the world long before she ever acted within it. Adolescence arrived not as a rupture, but as an expansion. Her body changed, her voice matured, and with these outward developments came an inward sharpening that the master sensed, but could neither define nor control. She had learned, long ago, that power revealed itself not only in commands, but in reactions, especially the reactions of those who believed themselves unassailable. Now, as she moved through the household with increasing responsibility, she watched these reactions closely, storing them with the same patience that had carried her through childhood. The master, for his part, found himself increasingly dependent on routine to reassure himself. Routine had always been his refuge, the structure that confirmed his authority and restored his sense of order. Yet as his daughter grew older, routine no longer operated as smoothly as it once had. It required negotiation, explanation, and justification. He framed these shifts as natural developments, the inevitable adjustments required when a child matured. But beneath this rationalization lay an unease he could not silence. He felt his authority being examined, not openly challenged, but quietly assessed. That assessment unsettled him because it suggested that obedience was no longer automatic, but chosen. He responded by tightening expectations once more, reinforcing the boundaries he believed essential to maintaining control. He spoke often of reputation, of appearances, of the dangers of stepping beyond prescribed roles. He warned against curiosity framed as ambition, against questioning framed as intelligence. His words carried an urgency that betrayed his fear that his daughter, understanding, was outpacing the narratives he had constructed to contain it. She listened to these warnings with careful attention, not because she accepted them as truth, but because she recognized their function. They were not meant to inform her. They were meant to reassure him. This realization did not provoke anger. It produced clarity. Clarity allowed her to respond strategically rather than emotionally. She nodded when expected, expressed gratitude when required, and maintained the composure that had become her shield. Outwardly, she appeared to embody the virtues he praised. Inwardly, she continued to refine her understanding of how power operated and why it feared scrutiny. The household itself reflected this growing tension. Servants moved with heightened caution, aware that the master, as patience had thinned over time. Small mistakes provoked sharp responses. Minor deviations were corrected with disproportionate force. The master justified this severity as necessary discipline, but its true source lay in his inability to locate the threat he sensed. Threats, when visible, could be confronted. This one remained elusive, embedded in silence, in observation, in the quiet competence of a daughter who no longer needed guidance to navigate his expectation. The woman's influence, though long absent physically, continued to shape the child's responses in subtle but decisive ways. The child remembered not only what had been said that night, but how it had been said without urgency, without fear, without the need to control outcome. That approach became her model. She learned to speak carefully, to choose moments when words could exist without being weaponized against her. She understood that timing mattered as much as content. This understanding allowed her to preserve her integrity without inviting confrontation. As she grew older, opportunities arose that tested this discipline. Visitors arrived with questions that skirted the edges of propriety. Discussions unfolded in which assumptions were stated confidently, awaiting affirmation. In these moments, she learned how to offer responses that neither confirmed nor contradicted overtly, that allowed her to remain present without endorsing narratives she knew to be incomplete. This balancing act required constant attention, but it came naturally to her now. She had been practicing it since childhood, since the night she learned that truth could exist quietly and still endure. The master observed these interactions with a mixture of pride and discomfort. Pride because his daughter's composure reflected well on him. Discomfort because her restraint suggested an independence he could not trace or claim credit for. He began to speak of her future with increasing specificity, outlining paths he deemed acceptable, roles he believed suitable. He framed these plans as guidance, as concern for her well-being. She listened politely, recognizing the underlying intent, to fix her trajectory before it diverged further from his control. She did not argue. Argument would expose the distance between their understandings prematurely. Instead, she asked careful questions framed as clarification rather than challenge. These questions unsettled him more than disagreement would have. Disagreement could be dismissed. Clarification required explanation, and explanation revealed the limits of his certainty. He responded with irritation masked as patience, repeating principles rather than addressing specifics. She noted this pattern, adding it to the archive of observations she carried. Time continued its work, and with it came moments the master could not fully manage. Illness, financial strain, external pressures all introduced variables that disrupted routine. In these moments his authority faltered visibly. Decisions were delayed. Instructions contradicted one another. The household sensed instability and responded with heightened vigilance. The child observed these moments carefully, recognizing them as points where the structure she lived within revealed its vulnerabilities. She did not exploit them. Exploitation would have been dangerous. Instead, she learned from them, understanding that authority depended on conditions remaining favorable. When those conditions shifted, authority revealed its fragility. The master, aware of these pressures, leaned more heavily on control as compensation. He invoked loyalty more frequently, emphasizing obedience as moral duty rather than expectation. He spoke of sacrifice, of the burdens he carried for the household's sake. These speeches were meant to inspire gratitude. Instead, they revealed how deeply he needed affirmation. The child listened, understanding that his need did not obligate her belief. Gratitude, she had learned, could be expressed without surrendering one's understanding. The woman's absence continued to shape the child's sense of self. She no longer needed to recall specific guidance. The framework she had been given had become internalized. She trusted her perceptions. She understood that silence could be protective rather than punitive. She recognized that compliance could be strategic rather than submissive. These insights did not isolate her. They grounded her, allowing her to move through the household without losing herself to its demands. As she approached adulthood, the master intensified his efforts to define her future decisively. He spoke of marriage, of alliances, expectations that would secure the householder's position. He framed these plans as inevitable, leaving little room for discussion. She received this information calmly, her response measured. She did not commit or resist openly. She asked for time to consider details, presenting her caution as diligence rather than hesitation. He accepted this explanation reluctantly, reassured by her tone if not entirely convinced. Behind this exchange lay a deeper shift the master could not name. His daughter was no longer merely responding to his authority, she was interpreting it. Interpretation, unlike obedience, introduced agency. Agency threatened the simplicity of his worldview. He responded by asserting tradition, by invoking precedent, by insisting that certain paths were not open for discussion. She listened, recognizing that insistence often masked uncertainty. The household felt the weight of these tensions as decisions loomed. Servants whispered cautiously, aware that transitions often invited upheaval. The child moved through these days with deliberate calm, aware that whatever future awaited her would be shaped not only by external arrangements, but by the understanding she carried within. She did not yet know how or when that understanding would need to surface openly. She only knew that it would. The master's attempts to reclaim certainty grew more urgent as he sensed time slipping beyond his control. He pressed for decisions, for commitments that would anchor his authority in permanence. She responded with courtesy, offering assurances without concessions. This dynamic strained their relationship, though neither named it as such. He interpreted her restraint as compliance. She understood it as preservation. The shock of what the woman had done that night continued to unfold in these moments, not as revelation, but as endurance. The woman had not altered events dramatically. She had altered perception. That alteration allowed the child to grow into herself with coherence intact, even within constraints designed to fragment identity. The master could not undo this change because he could not see it clearly. He could address behavior. He could not reach belief. As adulthood approached, the child, understanding, matured into discernment. She recognized that change, when it came, would not arrive through sudden defiance, but through accumulation of observation, of timing, of conditions aligning. She was prepared to wait. Waiting, she knew, was not surrender. It was strategy. The master continued to believe that authority, once asserted firmly enough, could shape outcome. He did not recognize that the most consequential change had already occurred quietly years earlier, in a nursery lit by a single lamp, when a woman he believed insignificant had chosen to listen rather than silence, to acknowledge rather than dismiss. That choice had given the child something no authority could confiscate, a stable sense of self, grounded in understanding rather than obedience. As the household moved toward an uncertain future, this grounding became her anchor. Whatever came next, whatever demands were placed upon her, whatever paths were prescribed, she would meet them with clarity rather than fear. And in that clarity lay the true consequence of what had been done that night, not shock as spectacle, but shock as permanence. A life redirected not through force, but through recognition. A future shaped not by the master's certainty, but by the quiet, enduring influence of a truth that had been allowed to exist. By the time the household began to speak openly of her future, the girl had already learned to think of time differently than those around her. For the master, time was something to be filled with decisions, contracts, and outcomes that reinforced his authority. For her, time had become a space, something to move through carefully, something to observe before acting. This difference shaped every interaction that followed, even when neither of them acknowledged it aloud. She understood now that the most important shifts did not happen at the moment of decision, but long before, in the slow accumulation of understanding that made certain outcomes inevitable and others impossible. The master's plans were laid out with increasing certainty. He spoke of alliances as though they were benevolent arrangements, of futures as though they were gifts bestowed rather than paths imposed. His language framed obligation as opportunity and obedience as protection. He believed these narratives sincerely, or at least he needed to believe them to maintain his sense of control. He did not question whether his daughter, a consent was assumed rather than earned. In his mind, consent was unnecessary where authority existed. The household had been structured around this assumption for generations. She listened to these plans with the same composure she had cultivated over years of careful observation. She did not interrupt. She did not contradict. She asked measured questions that focused on logistics rather than principles, on details rather than legitimacy. This approach reassured the master, who mistook engagement for agreement. He believed her calm indicated acceptance, that her silence signaled alignment. He did not realize that her questions were not steps toward compliance, but exercises in clarity, ways of understanding the terrain she would eventually need to navigate. As preparations advanced, the household grew increasingly tense. Servants sensed that a turning point approached, though none could articulate exactly what form it would take. Transitions always carried risk, especially when authority felt uncertain. The master's moods grew unpredictable. He oscillated between confidence and irritation, between reassurance and threat. These fluctuations revealed more than he intended. They exposed the strain beneath his certainty, the effort required to maintain a narrative that no longer felt secure. She noticed these fluctuations and adjusted accordingly. When his confidence peaked, she remained deferential, offering nothing that might puncture his sense of control. When his irritation surfaced, she became even more restrained, minimizing her presence to avoid becoming a target for his unease. This adaptability was not instinctive, it was learned, refined through years of watching how power reacted to perceived threat. She did not resent the need for such vigilance. Resentment, she had learned, clouded judgment. Clarity required distance. The woman's influence remained present in this clarity, though it no longer felt like influence in the conventional sense. It was not guidance she consciously followed, but a way of orienting herself to the world. She understood now that being seen, truly seen even once, could alter how a person understood their own worth. That understanding did not fade when the witness disappeared. It became internal, self-sustaining. The master could dictate behavior, but he could not erase the memory of recognition. As the household moved closer to the moment the master had chosen as decisive, subtle fractures appeared in his authority. Servants hesitated before carrying out instructions, sensing the volatility beneath his composure. Decisions were revisited, revised, sometimes contradicted. These inconsistencies did not go unnoticed. They confirmed what she had long understood, that authority depended on confidence, and confidence depended on belief. When belief wavered, authority became brittle. She did not exploit this brittleness. Exploitation would have invited retaliation. Instead, she observed it, filing away each instance as further evidence of the system's limitations. She understood now that systems built on control rather than understanding were inherently fragile. They required constant reinforcement, constant performance. Any sustained deviation, any refusal to internalize their narratives, threatened their coherence. The master sensed that something was slipping beyond his grasp, though he could not articulate what. He redoubled his efforts to define her future explicitly, pressing for commitments that would anchor his authority and permanence. He spoke of timelines, of expectations, of consequences for delay. His urgency revealed his fear more clearly than any admission could have. Fear, she knew, did not invalidate his power, but it altered how that power could be navigated. She responded with careful patience. She acknowledged his concerns without surrendering her understanding. She agreed to consider, to prepare, to comply with outward forms while preserving inward autonomy. This balance was delicate, requiring constant recalibration, yet she felt equal to it. She had been practicing this balance since childhood, since the night she learned that truth could be held quietly until conditions allowed it to surface safely. As the decisive moment approached, she found herself reflecting more frequently on the woman, not with longing, but with gratitude shaped by distance. She understood now that what the woman had offered was not answers, but orientation. She had shown her that silence could be chosen rather than imposed, that listening could be an act of care rather than submission. This orientation allowed her to move through uncertainty without losing herself to it. The household's final preparations unfolded with outward efficiency and inward strain. The master's authority appeared intact, but it required constant assertion. He issued instructions with increasing specificity, as though precision could substitute for trust. She followed these instructions meticulously, offering him no visible resistance. This obedience reassured him temporarily, though it never fully quieted his unease. Something in her gaze, in her composure, continued to unsettle him. He could not name it, but he felt it acutely. That feeling reached its peak in a moment that might have passed unnoticed in another household: a brief exchange, a question asked at an inopportune time, a silence that lingered too long. In that moment, the master realized that his daughter was no longer merely reacting to his authority. She was evaluating it. Evaluation implied distance. Distance implied independence. Independence in his worldview was dangerous. He responded with a show of force, asserting his authority sharply, publicly, in a way designed to remind everyone present of their place. The household froze, accustomed to such displays yet always wary of their consequences. She received this assertion calmly, her expression composed, her response measured. She did not flinch. She did not apologize excessively. She acknowledged his authority without internalizing his anger. This restraint unsettled him more than open defiance would have. Defiance could be punished. Composure could not. In that moment, the master understood, though he could not articulate it, that something irreversible had occurred, not because she had challenged him openly, but because she no longer needed his validation to define herself. That realization terrified him. He had built his world on the assumption that authority, once established, shaped identity. The presence of someone who could separate the two threatened the coherence of that world. He withdrew after the confrontation, framing it as resolution rather than escalation. He told himself he had reasserted control. The household resumed its routines cautiously, aware that the equilibrium had shifted. She returned to her tasks with the same quiet diligence she had always displayed. Outwardly, nothing appeared to have changed. Inwardly, everything had clarified. She understood now that the moment of open decision was approaching, whether she wished it or not. She could not remain indefinitely within the careful balance she had maintained. Time, which she had learned to inhabit patiently, was moving toward a point of convergence. She did not fear this convergence. She had prepared for it, even if she did not yet know its exact form. The master, unaware of the depth of her preparation, continued to believe he could shape outcome through assertion. He did not understand that the most significant shaping had already occurred, quietly, over years of listening, observing and preserving understanding. He could dictate the terms of her behavior, but he could not reclaim the authority he had lost over her inner life. As the household stood on the edge of transition, the shock of what the woman had done that night reached its fullest expression, not as a sudden revelation, but as a sustained transformation that could no longer be contained. The woman had not disrupted the household through action. She had disrupted it through recognition. She had seen the child as someone capable of understanding, and in doing so, she had altered the child as relationship to power forever. This alteration did not announce itself with rebellion or escape. It announced itself through endurance, through the refusal to internalize imposed narratives, through the quiet preservation of truth until it could be expressed without being destroyed. The master sensed this refusal without comprehending it fully. He felt its presence a threat, even as it remained invisible to others. And so the household moved forward, carrying within it a tension that could not be resolved through authority alone. The girl stood at the threshold of a future the master believed he controlled, while holding within her an understanding that would shape that future in ways he could neither predict nor prevent. The night that had once seemed singular now revealed itself as the beginning of a longer reckoning, one that did not end with the woman's removal, but continued unfolding through years of quiet resistance to erasure. The final consequence had not yet arrived, but it was no longer avoidable. The reckoning did not arrive with a single dramatic moment, nor did it announce itself through defiance or escape. It arrived the way truth often does in places governed by control, slowly, through accumulation, until the weight of what had been preserved could no longer be ignored. The master continued to believe that the future he had outlined was inevitable, that authority, once exercised firmly enough, would shape outcome as it always had. He mistook preparation for compliance and patience for submission. What he did not understand was that inevitability was a story he told himself to quiet doubt, not a law that governed reality. Reality had been changing quietly for years, guided by a child who had learned how to see without being seen. As the moment approached when plans would be formalized, arrangements finalized, and paths closed off with ceremony, the household moved with a careful urgency that betrayed its own anxiety. Servants spoke softly, tasks were executed with precision, and every action seemed calibrated to avoid provoking the master's increasingly brittle temper. He sensed the strain and interpreted it as anticipation rather than apprehension. Anticipation, after all, implied consent. He told himself that the household understood the importance of the transition ahead, that order was being secured through preparation. He did not see that preparation can also be a form of resistance when it is oriented toward preservation rather than obedience. She moved through these days with the same deliberate calm she had cultivated over years of careful living. Her composure was not the absence of feeling, it was the discipline of not allowing feeling to dictate timing. She understood now that the moment she chose to speak or to act would shape everything that followed. Premature action would only confirm the narratives the master relied upon to justify control. Waiting, however, would allow those narratives to reveal their own contradictions. She did not rush the process, she allowed it to unfold. The master's final attempts to secure certainty took the form of insistence. He spoke with increasing urgency, outlining expectations with greater specificity, framing compliance as gratitude and delay as disrespect. His words were firm, but beneath them ran a current of unease he could no longer fully conceal. He sensed that his authority, though intact on the surface, no longer reached where it once had. That loss frightened him, and fear sharpened his tone. He mistook sharpness for strength. She listened carefully, responding with respect and restraint. She did not argue the principles he invoked. She addressed the logistics he emphasized. She asked for clarification where ambiguity existed, presenting her caution as diligence rather than hesitation. This approach unsettled him more than disagreement would have. Disagreement could be crushed. Diligence required engagement, and engagement exposed the fragility of certainty. Each clarification he offered revealed another place where his narrative depended on assumption rather than truth. The household sensed the tension tightening, the way one senses a storm before it breaks. Servants avoided unnecessary movement, aware that the master's patience was thinning. Conversations shortened, eyes lowered. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation. In this charged stillness, the girl's calm stood out not as defiance, but as steadiness. She did not mirror the household as anxiety. She did not attempt to soothe it. She moved through it with clarity, aware that clarity itself was unsettling in a world built on managed confusion. The moment of reckoning arrived not as confrontation but as exposure. It came during a gathering meant to formalize the master's plans, a setting chosen precisely because it would make dissent difficult. Words were spoken confidently, assumptions stated as fact, expectations framed as mutual understanding. The master spoke of the future as though it had already been agreed upon, inviting affirmation rather than discussion. He expected gratitude, he expected compliance, he expected silence. What he did not expect was her question. It was not loud, it was not accusatory, it was precise. She asked for confirmation of a detail he had glossed over, a detail that revealed the cost of the arrangement more clearly than his broad assurances had allowed. The question was framed respectfully, offered as clarification rather than challenge. Yet it carried a weight that could not be ignored. It required him to articulate a truth he had relied on silence to conceal. The room stilled. Eyes turned toward him, waiting. He attempted to deflect, to reframe, to return to generalities. She did not press. She waited. Waiting, she knew, could be more insistent than interruption. The silence stretched, exposing the gap between what had been assumed and what could be justified. In that silence, the master felt the familiar ground of authority shift beneath him. He realized too late that the question had not been asked impulsively. It had been prepared carefully, chosen because it could exist without being dismissed, because it demanded response rather than punishment. He answered eventually, but the answer revealed more than he intended. It exposed the imbalance at the heart of his plans, the way choice had been assumed rather than offered, the way authority had substituted itself for consent. The room absorbed this revelation unevenly. Some looked away, others watched intently. The master felt the weight of their attention and responded with irritation masked as firmness, asserting his authority sharply, attempting to re-establish control through tone rather than substance. She did not retreat. She did not escalate. She acknowledged his authority without conceding the point. She thanked him for the clarification and fell silent again, allowing the answer to stand on its own. This restraint unsettled him more than argument would have. Argument could be framed as disrespect. Restraint left no such opening. It forced the room to sit with what had been revealed. The gathering concluded without resolution. The master withdrew, framing the exchange as a misunderstanding rather than a challenge. He told himself that authority had been maintained, that the matter would be addressed privately. Yet as the household dispersed, a subtle shift had occurred. Assumptions once held quietly had been spoken aloud. Silence had been broken not through confrontation but through clarity. That clarity could not be recalled. In the days that followed, the master attempted to regain control through private insistence. He confronted her with anger sharpened by fear, demanding explanation, obedience, affirmation. He invoked duty, tradition, consequence. She listened without flinching, responding with the same measured composure she had always displayed. She did not deny his authority. She did not apologize for her question. She explained her need for understanding, her desire for clarity before commitment. This explanation did not satisfy him. It could not. Satisfaction would have required him to acknowledge the legitimacy of her perspective. He escalated his demands, believing pressure would restore certainty. He underestimated the strength of preparation. She had spent years cultivating patience, discernment, and timing. Pressure did not break her. It clarified her resolve. She understood now that the balance she had maintained could not continue indefinitely. The moment for preservation had passed. The moment for articulation had arrived. She chose her words carefully, drawing on the framework the woman had given her long ago. She spoke of understanding rather than defiance, of consent rather than obedience. She named the difference between guidance and control without accusing him directly. She did not frame her position as rebellion. She framed it as integrity. This framing unsettled him profoundly. Integrity could not be dismissed as insolence. It demanded engagement. The master responded with anger, asserting his authority forcefully, threatening consequences he believed would compel compliance. Yet as he spoke, he felt the hollowness of his own words. The threats relied on fear he no longer fully commanded. He sensed it in her steady gaze, in her refusal to be rushed or provoked. He realized, with a shock that mirrored the one he had feared years earlier, that he no longer controlled the narrative shaping her decisions. The household watched this exchange with a mix of apprehension and recognition. Servants had long understood the limits of authority, though they rarely named them aloud. Seeing those limits exposed through quiet articulation rather than spectacle unsettled and affirmed them simultaneously. The master's power remained formidable, but it was no longer unquestioned. Questioning, once introduced, could not be contained easily. The resolution that followed was not clean or complete. Systems rarely yield gracefully. Compromises were made, paths adjusted, timelines altered. The master framed these changes as concessions he had chosen to grant, preserving his sense of control. She accepted what was offered without illusion, understanding the difference between narrative and reality. What mattered was not how the outcome was described, but how it altered her trajectory. She had secured space to choose, to delay, to define her future with greater autonomy than had once seemed possible. The woman's presence hovered quietly over this resolution, not as a ghost or symbol, but as the origin of a capacity that had now come into full expression. The woman had not given her answers or instruction. She had given her permission to trust her own perception, to hold truth carefully, to wait until clarity could be expressed without being destroyed. That permission had endured, shaping every decision that followed. The master, though outwardly victorious in preserving appearances, felt a loss he could not name. He had maintained authority, but at the cost of certainty. He understood now that obedience could be performed without belief, that compliance could coexist with independence of thought. This understanding unsettled him more deeply than any open rebellion would have. Rebellion could be punished. Independence could not. As the household settled into a new equilibrium, the girl, no longer a child, not yet fully free, moved forward with a steadiness born of hard-earned understanding. She did not romanticize what had occurred. She did not imagine that one exchange had transformed the world. She knew the system remained intact, its constraints still present. But within those constraints she had carved out something essential, the right to interpret her own experience, to weigh narratives against reality, to choose when and how to act. The shock of what the woman had done that night revealed itself fully in this outcome, not because it had overturned authority outright, but because it had made authority negotiable. It had introduced the possibility that power could be examined rather than absorbed, that silence could be chosen rather than enforced, that truth could be preserved until conditions allowed it to surface safely. Years later, when the girl would look back on the path that led her here, she would not remember a single dramatic act or moment of defiance. She would remember the night she was listened to without judgment, the first time her fear was acknowledged rather than dismissed. She would remember how that acknowledgement changed the way she understood herself and the world around her. Everything that followed the patience, the preparation, the eventual articulation had grown from that seed. History rarely records such moments. They leave no marks on ledgers, no entries in official accounts. Yet they shape lives in ways that outlast authority and endure beyond circumstance. The woman the master believed he had purchased to care quietly had done something far more consequential. She had recognized a child, its capacity for understanding, and treated it with respect. That recognition had altered the course of a life, and, in doing so, exposed the limits of control. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you, challenged you, or made you reconsider what power looks like when it is quietly resisted, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you don't miss the stories history tried to bury, and leave a comment sharing how deeply this journey affected you. Because some acts do not shock through noise or violence. They shock through permanence. They change what cannot be undone. And once truth is allowed to exist even briefly, it has a way of finding its voice, no matter how carefully silence is enforced.